Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Laik Sivihi, the father of Holophase. Part 30. Omega 2 and K2 as intensity measures. Remember the language we are learning together. There is one field phi, the holophase, one continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, three dimensions show themselves at once: time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi is changing, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, we listen to just one of those echoes. We have journeyed far into the grammar of motion. We have followed waves as they propagate, we have seen them form into traveling phrases, and we have witnessed how they converse through interference. Those stories were told in the language of the waves themselves, the language of amplitude and phase, of crests and troughs, of shifting shapes in time and space. But there is another dialect inside the holophase, a way of speaking that does not focus on the detailed shape of the story, but on its strength. How strong is this change? How intense is this pattern? Today, we begin a new chapter. We step away from the purely linear flow of waves and enter the realm of the quadratic. We start to learn how to measure intensity. We explore omega squared, written omega squared, and the squared magnitude of k, written k squared, as intensity measures. This is where we begin to count, to tally, to compare the vigor of change in the field. It is the foundation of all concepts of power, contrast, and, in the language of conventional physics, what is usually called energy. Let us start with the idea of moving from rate to vigor, the need for an activity meter. Imagine you're listening to a musical note. You can describe that note in two very different ways. First, by its pitch. Is it high or low? That tells you how fast the air pressure is oscillating, how many cycles per second you have. That is the frequency, our old friend omega. Second, by its loudness. Is it a whisper or a roar? That tells you the strength of those oscillations, how vigorous they are. Pitch and loudness are related but distinct. A very high-pitched note can be barely audible. A very low note can be overwhelmingly loud. In the holophase language, omega tells us the rate of temporal change, the pitch of time at a given point. But by itself, it does not tell us how vigorous that change is. A field can be oscillating very rapidly with a large omega, but with such a tiny amplitude that the change is almost invisible. Or the field can be oscillating slowly with a small omega, but with such a huge swing in amplitude that it dominates everything. So we need a way to measure this vigor, this intensity of change, separately from the mere rate. We need an activity meter, something that says, regardless of the sign, regardless of direction, how strong is this change? This is where the simple but profound act of squaring enters our language. First, consider omega square, the intensity of time change. Take omega, the rate at which phi is cycling in time at a point. To get a measure of the intensity of this temporal activity, we look at omega squared. If omega is how many times per second the field completes a cycle, then omega squared is a way of telling how much temporal oomph is packed into that cycling, when combined with amplitude. Squaring makes the sign irrelevant. Whether the phase is advancing or retarding, omega squared is always non-negative. It turns the directional rate into a pure measure of temporal intensity. In the holophase language, omega square plays the role of an intensity accent on the time shadow. It is not a new letter, and it is not a new word. It is more like putting a word in bold, underlining it, or speaking it with emphasis. It answers the question, regardless of the exact pattern of change in time, how intensely is the field changing here? Operationally, for a simple oscillation, the tally involving omega squared, usually multiplied by the square of the wave's amplitude, is proportional to what conventional physics would call the average kinetic part of the oscillation. It captures the busyness of the temporal derivative, how vigorously the field is being flung back and forth in time. In a vibrating string, a higher omega squared at the same amplitude means the elements of the string are moving faster during each cycle. They have more zip in time. Now apply the same logic to space and to k. The vector k, the wave number, tells us the spatial rate of change, how many waves fit into a meter, the pitch of space. But again, we can ask, is this spatial pattern just a faint, fine whisper of texture, or is it a bold, coarse engraving? To get a measure of spatial intensity, we look at the squared magnitude of k, written k squared. This quantity measures the intensity of spatial variation. A large k squared means the field has tight, rapid spatial undulations. The pattern is finely textured with lots of sharp turns and detailed edges. A small k squared means the field changes gently over space. The pattern is broad and smooth. In the language of meaning, k square is a kind of contrast accent on the space shadow. It asks, regardless of the direction or detailed geometry of spatial change, how sharp are the variations here? How much detailed structure is packed into this region of space? Scientifically, for a wave pattern, k square, again combined with amplitude squared and appropriate material constants, often appears in what we describe as potential or elastic contributions. It tallies how bent, twisted, or curled the field is in space. In a stretched string, a standing wave with larger k square means the string is more sharply curved between its fixed points. More tension is stored in the bends. Why do we square these quantities rather than just using omega or k directly as our intensity measures? There are two deep reasons that come out of the mathematics, and both have strong semantic meaning. The first reason is positivity. Omega can be positive or negative depending on phase conventions. K is a vector that can point in different directions. But intensity should not depend on sign or direction. Loudness is not negative. Contrast does not care whether a line slopes up or down. It cares how steep it is. Squaring strips away the directional or sign information and leaves a pure measure of magnitude. How much, not which way. The second reason is additivity. When multiple waves are present, they interfere. Their amplitudes, phases, and directions combine in complicated ways. If you try to add the omegas directly, you quickly run into trouble. They can cancel or combine in ways that do not track the total vigor of the field. But something beautiful happens when you look at squared quantities. Under the right averaging procedures, you can add the contributions to omega squared and k squared from different components and get a meaningful total intensity. The interference cross terms that complicate the instantaneous amplitude often drop out when you are computing sums of squares over cycles or ensembles. This makes omega squared and k squared ideal for bookkeeping. They let you say, in this region, the total tally of temporal busyness is this much, and the total tally of spatial sharpness is that much, even if, underneath that, the amplitudes are dancing in a complex interference pattern. This additivity is what allows these quadratic measures to become the backbone of the universe's accounting system for what conventional physics calls energy. In the holophase model, energy is not a substance. It is a way of counting patterns. The squares of omega and k, together with amplitude and material factors, are the basic entries in that ledger. These intensity measures echo powerfully across all three shadows: time, space, and motion. In the time echo, omega squared is like the volume knob of rhythm. When you listen to a sound, the loudness you perceive is directly related to how large the squared rate of pressure change is, combined with amplitude. A rapidly beating heart with strong contractions is an example of high temporal intensity. Both the rate and strength of contraction are up. The flicker of a light can also carry different intensities. The intensity of its temporal oscillation, when sustained, is experienced as brightness or power. Omega tells you how fast it flickers. Omega squared, together with amplitude, tells you how strongly that flicker is driving changes per unit time. In the space echo, k squared appears as the resolution of texture. Imagine looking at a photograph. The overall shapes and smooth gradients correspond to low k components. slow spatial variation. The sharp edges, fine lines, and tiny details correspond to high K components. The local intensity in K squared tells you how much fine structure is present in a region. A high-definition image has a lot of high K squared content. A blurry image has most of its intensity concentrated at low K squared. The jagged outlines of a mountain range, the intricate veins in a leaf, the crisp letters on a page, all of these are rich in high K squared contributions. In the motion echo, the combination of omega squared and kappa squared, tied together by the dispersion relation, influences the cost of propagation for a pattern. In many physical systems, patterns with very high temporal intensity and very sharp spatial structure behave differently from those that are gentle in both. They might disperse faster, radiate more strongly, or require more structured support from the medium to persist. In more advanced language, this relationship between temporal and spatial intensity is the seed of the concepts of a Lagrangian or an action density, quantities that summarize how costly or natural a given mode of change is for the field. For our purposes here, you can think of it as the metabolic rate of a traveling phrase in the holophase language. Within the master tree, omega square and k square sit at the base of what we can call quadratic semantics. Up to now, we have been mostly in the realm of linear semantics, describing how phi changes, its derivatives, its dispersion relations, its wave packets, its interferences. With omega square and k square, we take the first step into a different but related tower. This tower is about balances, about conserved tallies, about intensity and power. We move from describing the shape of change to describing how much change is happening. These quadratic measures are first-order guests in a second-order house. They are built directly out of the first derivatives, omega and k. But squaring them changes their role. They become the basic building blocks of all energy-like tallies: kinetic terms, potential terms, stress measures, and more. From here, we can build quantities that remain constant over time, or that flow from place to place, telling us how the field redistributes its activity without ever creating or destroying this tally out of nothing. They relate to many neighboring branches of the tree. They are obviously children of the core alphabet. You cannot have omega squared without first having omega, nor k squared without k. They connect deeply to wave packets and interference, because when we speak of the intensity of a wave packet, we are really talking about integrals or sums of omega squared and k squared over the packet's spatial and temporal shape. When two packets interfere, the amplitude pattern can show complex addition and cancellation, but the intensity pattern, the spatial and temporal distribution of squared quantities, has its own structure. This is why you can cross two bright light beams and still get significant heating, even if in some places the amplitudes cancel and appear dark. The total intensity as a tally is still there. They relate tightly to dispersion relations. Many dispersion relations can be written as links between omega squared and k squared with other parameters, such as mass or stiffness. For example, in a simple medium where waves travel at a constant speed, the dispersion relation says that omega is proportional to k, and so omega squared is proportional to k squared. That tight relationship fixes the speed at which patterns travel. Changing the medium changes the proportionality, and therefore how temporal and spatial intensities balance for a moving wave. They also serve as the raw ingredients for future balance semantics. The classic examples of kinetic and potential energy in oscillating systems are built from quantities proportional to omega squared and k squared times amplitude squared. As an oscillator swings back and forth, its kinetic tally rises while its potential tally falls, and then they trade roles. The sum remains constant. This rhythmic exchange is nothing more than a graceful dance between temporal and spatial intensity tallies. In the holophase interpretation, it is essential to be clear about what we mean by energy. In the conventional view, energy is often spoken of as if it were a substance, like a fluid being pulled back and forth. In the holophase view, we instead say, energy is not a substance at all. It is a way of counting. It is a ledger entry that summarizes how intense the activity of phi's derivatives is in time and in space. Omega square and K square, combined with amplitude and material constants, are the primary columns in that ledger. Saying a system has high energy is, in our language, saying this configuration of phi exhibits patterns with a high tally of omega square and K square. It is a statement about the state of the field, not about an invisible fluid. So what is the semantic meaning of these quadratic measures? They define the dimension of emphasis and significance. In any narrative, not all words carry the same weight. Some are background, some are foreground, some are spoken softly, some are shouted. Omega squared and chi squared provide the holophase language with a way to assign weight to different patterns. They tell us which temporal rhythms dominate and which are faint. They tell us which spatial features stand out as high contrast and which fade into gentle slopes. In doing this, they transform a purely geometric, descriptive view of the field into a map of concentrated activity. They answer questions like, where is the action? Where is the field most vigorously engaged in changing? Which scales in time and space matter the most for the dynamics? This makes them indispensable for understanding where the universe is spending its efforts. These measures also show a rich structure of stability and variability. In a closed, idealized system with no losses, certain tallies built from omega squared and K squared remain stable in time. This is the deep root of conservation laws. The total intensity account, when defined appropriately, stays constant even though the specific patterns, the individual waves and packets, shift, interfere, and move. That stability is not imposed from outside. It arises from the symmetries of the field equations, such as invariance under shifts in time or space. Locally, however, these intensities can vary wildly. A wave packet focuses intensity into a moving lump. Interference patterns carve it into fringes, bright and dark, high tally and low tally, side by side. The claim that omega squared and K squared and combinations built from them are meaningful measures of activity is tested constantly in experiment. In acoustics, for example, the power carried by a sound wave depends on both amplitude and frequency. If you hold amplitude fixed in a given mode, increasing the frequency increases the power delivered to a microphone or a detector. The dependence on the square of the rate of change appears naturally in the formulas that relate sound pressure, particle velocity, and power. In mechanics, for a simple mass on a spring, the maximum kinetic energy scales with omega squared times amplitude squared. You can test this by measuring how much work the oscillator can do lifting a weight. The work done follows the predicted scaling precisely. In electromagnetism, the standard energy density of the wave involves squared electric and magnetic fields, which themselves are tied to frequencies and wave numbers. Across physics, these quadratic forms show up everywhere power, heating, and work are measured. Their universal success is a strong confirmation that we are indeed looking at the right kind of tally. These ideas are not abstract. They are behind what you directly experience in everyday life. The loudness of sound is an experience of temporal intensity. A mosquito's buzz has a high frequency but small amplitude. A tuba's note has lower frequency but can have enormous amplitude. Both contribute to the overall power you hear and feel, depending on how amplitude and omega square combine. The brightness and color of light are also reflections of this logic. Color is tied to frequency, but brightness is tied to how many such cycles per second per area are coming in, weighted by their energy. A blue photon has a higher frequency than a red photon, and beams of light with different colors and intensities correspond to different underlying tallies in their omega square-based ledger. In solids, atoms vibrate in place. As the temperature increases, the average intensity of those vibrational modes increases. In many models, temperature can be thought of as a measure of the average squared speed of these microscopic motions. In the language we are developing, that is very close to saying temperature is a measure of average omega squared in the vibrational field combined with amplitude. More vigorous microscopic oscillation corresponds to higher thermal intensity. In the spatial domain, you see K squared every time you look at the world. Rugged terrain with sharp cliffs and jagged peaks corresponds to high spatial intensity, lots of high k-squared content. Gently rolling hills correspond to low k-squared. When scientists compress images to save space, they often do it by transforming the image into a frequency or wavenumber space, then discarding the components with small contributions to intensity, especially at high k-squared. Your eyes, too, are selective. They care a lot about edges and contours, zones where k-squared is high, because these are places where the spatial story changes quickly and therefore carries more information. The same pattern, quality plus intensity, appears in human and abstract life. When you feel an emotion, you can name its quality: sadness, joy, anger, calm. But you also feel its intensity: mild sadness versus overwhelming grief, quiet contentment versus ecstatic joy. That intensity dimension is directly analogous to a quadratic measure. In perception, your visual system automatically highlights regions of high contrast and edge density. Those regions feel more salient. Your auditory system privileges louder sounds. Your attention jumps to those high omega square events. In economics, the volatility of a market is a temporal intensity measure. It does not care about the absolute price level. It cares about how wildly the price changes over time. A stock can be cheap but extremely volatile, or expensive but very stable. Volatility is like omega squared applied to price movements. In society, the sharpness of polarization in public opinion is analogous to chi-squared in an abstract opinion space. It is not just that people disagree, it is that they disagree in highly contrasted, sharply separated ways. In art and music, these ideas become creative tools. A composer shapes not just which notes are played, but how loud and how soft, the dynamic range, thereby sculpting the temporal intensity profile of the music. A visual artist decides how much contrast to use, where to place sharp lines and where to soften them, thereby sculpting the spatial intensity map of the canvas. You can train yourself to read quadratic intensity in your own experience. When you hear a sound, try to separate pitch from loudness in your attention. Listen to the siren of an ambulance. Notice its high pitch, that is omega. Now notice how piercing or soft it is. That is related to omega squared times amplitude. When you look at a complex scene, first take in the broad shapes, the low structure. Then deliberately shift your gaze to the fine details. The texture of a fabric, the grain of wood, the tiny lines on your own hand. You are now paying attention to high squared content. When you exercise, reflect on the difference between how fast your body is moving and how hard it feels. The speed is like omega. The effort, the burn, the fatigue are connected to the quadratic intensity of the signals and forces inside your muscles and nervous system. A simple, tangible exercise is this. Take a pencil and lightly scribble on a piece of paper. Listen to the sound, see the faint line. Then, using the same speed of hand motion, press much harder and scribble again. The pitch of the scratchy sound might remain similar, but the loudness increases and the line becomes darker and more prominent. You have kept omega roughly the same while raising the effective quadratic intensity, both omega squared times amplitude in sound and k squared times amplitude in the spatial deposition of graphite. Without naming it, you have been manipulating these measures all your life. As always, we return to phi. We can now see that its story is told in layers. The first layer is the direct description of change, omega k v, how the field is moving and shaping itself in time and space. The second layer is a commentary on that story. How emphatic is each change? Where are the crescendos and where are the whispers? Omega square and k square provide that commentary. They show that the holophase language has a built-in system of emphasis and weighting. It can whisper and it can shout. The act of squaring is not a mathematical gimmick. It is a grammatical necessity for creating a world that has weight, consequence, and contrast. With this step, we cross a threshold. We are no longer only describing the alphabet and grammar of motion, we are beginning to understand how the universe keeps score on its own activity. From this foundation, the great structures of dynamics, action, Lagrangians, Hamiltonians, conservation laws, will arise naturally as sophisticated ways of organizing and balancing these intensity tallies. As we close this part, hold a simple image in your mind. The cosmos is not just a dance of forms, it is a dance of emphasized forms. Behind every wave, every vibration, every flicker, every pattern, there runs a silent account, a ledger of intensity. Omega squared and chi squared are among the primary columns in that ledger. This is how the field knows where the action is concentrated. This is how a photon can be more energetic than another. This is how a mountain range asserts its presence against a plane. It is the mathematics of significance. You live inside this ledger. Your ears are exquisite readers of acoustic omega squared. Your eyes are expert interpreters of spatial chi squared. Every time you feel heat, hear volume, or see contrast, you are perceiving these quadratic measures translated into sensation. You have been fluent in this aspect of the holophase language since childhood. Now you are putting a name and a structure to it. We have taken the first step into a new semantic realm. From here, we will see how these intensity measures combine and balance, and how they give rise to the supreme organizing principle of motion, the principle of least action. That is a story for another part of our journey. For now, simply listen to the world's volume and look at its sharpness. Realize that you are beginning to read the universe in bold. Peace be upon you.